On the night of December 20th, 1891, the temperature in Ember Ridge, Wisconsin fell to 31 degrees below zero. Not 31 degrees, 31 below. The kind of cold that did not announce itself with wind or drama. It simply arrived, settled over the land like a stone being placed on a grave, and began its work. Rooftops cracked under the weight of ice. Iron pipes split open and flooded cellars with water that froze before it finished falling. The blacksmith's forge, which had burned every day for 11 years, went cold that night because even the blacksmith would not leave his bed to tend it. 4 families burned their furniture. 3 lost portions of their roofs. 2 children never woke up. And beneath the floor of a leaning woodshed on the eastern edge of town, a 32-year-old widow named Margaret Owens was making tea. She heated the water in a copper pot set on a clay oven no larger than a bread box. The oven sat in the northwest corner of an underground chamber she had carved from the earth with her own hands, 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, 5 feet deep at the center. The walls were raw earth, smooth and packed tight. The ceiling was the underside of the woodshed floor. The temperature inside that chamber on the coldest night in 15 years was 56 degrees Fahrenheit. She did not know what was happening in town. She did not need to know. She poured the tea, wrapped both hands around the tin cup, and listened to the wind try to find her. It could not. To understand why Margaret Owens was still alive that night, you need to go back 8 months. Back to April, into the particular silence of a farmhouse where a man had just stopped breathing. Thomas Owens died on the 14th of April, 1891. He was 40 years old and had been by every visible measure a man built to outlast most things. He had shoulders broad enough to carry a crossbeam and hands that could split a cord of oak without stopping for water. He had a temper that ran hot in winter and cooled by spring, a stubbornness that Margaret had spent 3 years working around before she learned to work with it, and a way of reading weather from the angle of light on the far field that she had never seen in anyone else. The pneumonia took him in 6 days. He had been fine on a Monday. By Thursday, he could not stand. By Sunday morning, he was gone. Margaret sat beside his bed through the final night. She did not sleep. She held his hand, which had gone from warm to cool over the course of the hours, and she watched his face, and she thought about things she would not have admitted to thinking about. She thought about the northeast corner of the field where Thomas had planted barley the previous autumn as an experiment. He had noticed that the soil there held moisture differently than the rest and wanted to test it. The barley had come up thin. He had been planning to try rye this spring. She would have to decide about the rye herself. That was what her mind did in those hours. Not grief, not fear, calculation. She had been doing it since she was a girl, the constant, quiet arithmetic of survival that her father had put into her before she could name it. She hated herself a little for it, sitting there while Thomas breathed his last. She thought she should be weeping. Instead, she was thinking about rye. When he finally stopped breathing at 4 in the morning, the first thing she felt was not sorrow. It was the specific ache of losing the one person who had understood her without requiring an explanation. Then a few seconds later, the sorrow arrived. She let it come. The funeral was held 3 days later. The ground was still half frozen, and the grave took 2 men and most of a morning to dig properly. Reverend George Pratt presided, a 55-year-old man with silver hair and a voice calibrated over decades to project both warmth and authority. He was good at funerals. He knew what people needed to hear, and he knew how to deliver it, and Margaret might have found comfort in his words if she had not noticed midway through the service the particular way he was watching her. He came to her after the burial when the other mourners were dispersing toward their wagons. "Mrs. Owens." He took her hand in both of his. His grip was dry and firm, a practiced grip. "Thomas was a good man. This community will feel his absence." "Thank you, Reverend. I want you to know that you are not alone in this. There are families in this congregation who would open their homes to you at least through the transition. You should not have to manage that property by yourself." Margaret looked at him steadily. He had kind eyes. She had noticed over 8 years of Sunday services that kind eyes were sometimes the most dangerous kind. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "but I intend to stay on the property." Pratt's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. It was not displeasure. It was something closer to the look a doctor gives when a patient declines a recommended treatment. "Of course, but should circumstances change, the offer stands." He patted her hand once and released it. On his way to his own wagon, he paused to speak briefly with Edmund Crane Thomas's older brother, who was standing at the edge of the cemetery with his younger brother Wallace. Margaret watched the 3 men exchange words she could not hear. Edmund nodded once. Pratt moved on. Margaret filed that away and said nothing. She would learn later through the particular osmosis of small-town information what Pratt had said to Edmund that day. He had said that woman has the eyes of her father, and I once heard it said that Joseph Weir never left a mine without knowing where the second exit was. At the time, neither man understood what that observation meant. Margaret would make certain of it. The Crane brothers arrived formally on the 15th of May, 5 weeks after Thomas was in the ground. They came in the morning, which Margaret had always thought was revealing about a person's intentions. People who came in the afternoon were uncertain. People who came in the morning had already decided. Edmund was 38, the eldest of 3 sons, a broad-shouldered man with the same frame as Thomas, but without Thomas's particular quality of stillness. Edmund was always slightly in motion, always slightly forward, as if the world required constant management. He had a competent manner that had probably served him well in most situations and had led him, Margaret suspected, to underestimate the number of situations where competence alone was insufficient. Wallace was 35. He hung back while Edmund spoke the way younger brothers learn to do when the older one has always handled the talking. He had a habit of smiling at moments that did not call for smiling, a kind of reflexive pleasantness that covered something Margaret had never quite identified in 8 years of family dinners. Edmund sat down at Margaret's kitchen table without being invited. He spread the papers across the surface as if he were a surveyor establishing a baseline. The deed signed in the name of the Crane family patriarch, the legal correspondence, and on top of it all, a small envelope. "The property has always been held in my father's name," Edmund said. Thomas was a tenant, essentially with the understanding that the land would pass back to the family. "There is nothing in writing that gives you any claim." Margaret did not look at the papers. She looked at Edmund. "Did you know that Thomas planted barley in the northeast corner of the field last autumn?" Edmund stopped. The question had not been in his script. "Barley," she continued. "He noticed the soil there holds water differently than the rest. He had been watching that corner for 3 years before he tried it. He was planning to rotate to rye this spring." She paused. 8 years. He knew every inch of this land. I knew it with him. "Mrs. Owens," Edmund's voice had cooled, "that is not relevant to the legal question." "Then let me ask about the legal question. Has the matter been brought before a county court?" A beat of silence. "Not yet." "Then until it is, I am on property I have lived on for 8 years, and I am not leaving." She pushed the envelope back across the table without opening it. "I don't need fair money." Edmund's face went through several things in quick succession. Wallace from the corner let out a short sound that was not quite a laugh. Edmund gave him a look that stopped it. He gathered the papers methodically, returned them to his coat, and stood. "You have 30 days, he said. "After that, we will pursue this through formal channels." "I'll be here," Margaret said. She watched them ride out from the kitchen window. She stood there for a while after the sound of the horses had faded, looking at the empty road. Then she went to find the shovel. Before she found the shovel, she needed supplies. There were things she could improvise and things she could not, and the difference between them was the difference between surviving and not. She made a list in her head on the walk into town. Rope, 2 wooden buckets, an old stovepipe as long as she could find. Harold Briggs ran the general store on the main street of Ember Ridge, a low-ceilinged establishment that smelled of sawdust and lamp oil and the particular mustiness of bolts of fabric that had not been moved in years. He was 50 years old, thick-set, with a reddish face that suggested either exertion or bourbon, and was probably some combination of both. He was not a dishonest man. He was something more practical than dishonest. He was a man who understood leverage. He served her without comment until she put her money on the counter. "I heard the Crane family gave you 30 days, he said, not looking up from the tally. "News travels. Small town." He wrote a number and slid the paper across. Margaret looked at it. The total was 30% higher than the marked prices on the shelf. "You've added an error," she said. "Risk premium." He met her eyes for the first time. "You're not exactly a secure credit risk, Mrs. Owens. No collateral. I'm paying cash." "Even so." She held his gaze for a moment, then counted out the full amount without further comment. Briggs took the money, boxed the goods, and slid them across the counter. Then as she was lifting the box, "You need anything else, you come back. I've always got stock." He said it pleasantly as if he were doing her a favor. Margaret picked up her box and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, not turning around, just standing there for a breath. Then she continued out into the cold. Briggs watched her go and felt, for reasons He could not immediately identify the first small stirring of something that was not quite certainty about how this story was going to end. On the walk home, Margaret was not thinking about Briggs. She was thinking about the stovepipe. She had bought the 4-inch diameter, which was what she could afford, but what she needed was 5. The difference mattered because of the angle. For a natural draft to work properly in a ventilation shaft that ran upward at approximately 35 degrees, a 4-inch pipe was right at the edge of sufficient. It would work, probably, but the margin was thin and there was no room in this plan for probably. She walked 3 miles back to the farm doing the geometry in her head. By the time she reached the gate, she had worked out that 35 degrees was achievable if she was precise with the placement, and that precise meant going slowly and checking the draft with a candle flame before she trusted her life to it. She set the box down inside the door and stood in her kitchen for a moment looking at nothing. Then she thought about her father. Joseph Weir had worked underground for 18 years. He had started in the southwestern Pennsylvania coalfields at the age of 22 and had not come back to surface life for good until Margaret was a small child. He was missing the index finger of his left hand from an accident in 1871, which meant that every diagram he ever drew, every line he traced in the air, to show her something was drawn with his middle finger instead. Margaret had spent her whole childhood watching that hand explain the world. He was not a sentimental man, and he was not a patient one, but he had a particular quality that Margaret recognized only in retrospect as extraordinary. He taught her things because he believed she was capable of understanding them, not because he thought she might need them one day. The idea that knowledge had a practical ceiling, that there were things women did not need to know, had apparently never occurred to him. Or if it had, he had dismissed it without much consideration. One winter evening when Margaret was 15, he came home from a shift with a look on his face she had learned to associate with something that had impressed him. He sat down at the kitchen table and, using a stick of charred wood on the back of a flour sack, drew a cross-section of the earth. He drew the surface, the frost line, the layers below. Then he drew a circle at a depth of 6 feet and tapped it with his middle finger. "They opened up a pocket today," he said, "sealed off 20 years ago when the old shaft flooded. The air in there was 58 degrees. He looked at her to make sure she understood the significance. Outside today was 8 degrees. Inside that sealed pocket 20 years later, 58. Why, she asked. He drew the layers again more slowly. What he explained was this: below a certain depth, the earth maintains a temperature that does not respond to the seasons. The sun heats the surface. The wind strips that heat away. But 6 feet down, the soil and clay and stone have a thermal mass so enormous that they hold the warmth of all the summers they have ever known and release it so slowly that the change is measured not in days or months, but in decades. A chamber properly dug at that depth will stay between 55 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what is happening above. It will not heat you the way a fire does, but it will not let you freeze. It is the difference between fighting winter and simply removing yourself from it. Why doesn't anyone build underground? Margaret asked. Her father leaned back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Because people are afraid of what they can't see, he said. And because the men who know what I know work underground for wages and don't own enough land to make it matter. He paused. But if you ever needed to, you could. The earth would keep you. Margaret looked at the cross-section drawing for a long time. She asked 2 more questions, both of which her father answered. Then she helped her mother clear the table and did not think about it again for 17 years. Until the day Edmund Crane laid papers on her kitchen table and told her she had 30 days. She began digging on the 3rd of November. She chose the woodshed because it was the most defensible choice, a structure that already existed that no one would question for having smoke near it, that sat on 6 flat limestone foundation stones rather than a poured footing, which meant the ground beneath it had never been disturbed. The shed was 10 feet by 12, used for storing split wood tools and a grinding wheel that had not been touched in 3 years. The soil beneath it was a mix of sandy loam and clay, dark and still workable, but only barely. Within a week, the frost line would descend and the earth would set like iron. She worked in 2-hour shifts, which her father had taught her was the right interval for sustained physical labor. Long enough to make progress, short enough to avoid the mistakes that come from exhaustion. She took each bucket of excavated earth, roughly 12 pounds, and carried it into the woods behind the property, scattering it wide so that no single pile would draw attention. She worked alone. No one came to watch. The nearest neighbors, a family named Lundgren, lived a mile and a half south and minded their own affairs. On the second day, her hands blistered. She stopped, looked at the blisters, and tore an old linen shirt of Thomas's into strips. It was the blue one he wore on Saturdays, the one she had washed more times than she could count. She wrapped her palms without particular ceremony and went back to work. That was the only moment she allowed herself to think about Thomas directly during those 9 days. Everything else was geometry and physics and the mute satisfaction of watching the chamber take shape. The fifth day brought a problem. She was extending the eastern wall when the soil shifted from sandy loam to a layer of wet clay, and without warning, a section of the wall about 2 feet wide came loose and slumped into the floor. She stopped digging. She sat on the dirt floor of the half-finished chamber in the dim light coming through the shed floorboards, and she counted to 10 and then to 10 again. It was not catastrophic. The section that had slumped was not structural. She could work around it, shore up the area with a temporary brace, and reinforce it properly once she had the overhead beams in place. She knew this. Her father had told her more than once that the miners who died in collapses were almost never killed by the initial fall. They were killed by what they did in the 30 seconds after it, by the running, by the screaming, by the frantic, airless decisions made in the grip of a fear that used up the last of their oxygen. She did not run. She looked at the slump, mapped its edges, and spent the next 2 hours rigging a horizontal brace from a section of old fencing she salvaged from the property line. Oak, 20 years weathered, still solid. Then she moved to the western wall and continued. On the 8th day, she heard horses. She had been in the chamber for 3 hours deeper than usual, focusing on the final depth at the center. The horses came from the direction of the main road, and even muffled through the shed walls and 6 inches of earth, she recognized the particular cadence of the crane horses, which were heavier-footed than most working animals in the county. She went still. She set down the shovel without a sound. Through a gap between 2 warped boards in the shed wall, she could see a narrow strip of the yard. Edmund. He had dismounted and was standing at the edge of the property looking toward the shed. He stood there for a long time. Margaret did not breathe in any way that required effort. The problem was the earth. She had been moving a bucket load just before the horses arrived, and she had not had time to empty it. The bucket sat just inside the shed door, full of the fresh red clay subsoil that she had struck at the deepest point of the chamber. It was a different color than the surface soil, unmistakably raw and newly turned. If Edmund opened that door, he would see it. He stood at the edge of the yard for what felt like a very long time. Margaret, 8 feet away and 5 feet below the surface, held the shovel across her lap and watched the sliver of visible yard through the gap in the boards. Edmund spat in the snow. He turned his horse. He rode away. Margaret waited until the sound of hooves had faded completely before she moved. Then she climbed up through the open trap door she had, rough cut in the shed floor, carried the incriminating bucket into the woods, buried its contents under 6 inches of dead leaves, and came back to sweep the floor of the shed with an old broom until no trace of red earth remained. She worked for another hour before stopping, not because she was tired, but because her hands were shaking slightly, and she knew better than to dig when her hands were shaking. She made tea instead and sat in the shed with Bessie, who leaned her large head against Margaret's shoulder in the way the cow had been doing since that summer, and she let the shaking subside. That night, she made a decision. She would not leave the bucket inside again. She would not leave any trace outside the normal appearance of a woodshed with a woman trying to make it through winter. Every shovelful of earth would be managed as if Edmund's eyes were always on the yard, because they might be. The chamber took 9 days total, 8 feet long, 6 wide, 5 deep at center. She reinforced the overhead beams with 2 additional crossbeams, salvaged from that collapsed fence, each one hewn from oak and still structurally sound despite 2 decades of weather. She installed the ventilation pipe, threading it upward from the rear corner through a gap she dug near the back wall of the shed, disguising its exterior outlet with a careful stack of firewood. Before she sealed it in place, she set a candle at the base of the pipe and watched the flame. It tilted slowly but definitively toward the opening. The draft was working. The relief she felt at that moment was not what she had expected. It was not the relief of someone who had been uncertain and now was not. It was quieter than that, more like the recognition of something she had always known but had not yet had occasion to prove. She lined the floor with 8 inches of dry straw from the barn, then layered over it with 3 wool blankets she had stitched together from old coats, her mother's quilt from 1872, and 2 deer hides Thomas had tanned 3 years before. She built the clay oven in the northwest corner from smooth river stones. She carried half a mile in a cloth sack, mixing the mortar from claywood ash and water by hand. The oven was small. It was efficient. It was exactly what she needed. She brought Bessie into the shed 2 days before the first serious cold. The cow, 1,200 pounds and reliably warm, filled the upper space with body heat that filtered down through the floorboards like a second furnace. Margaret had not planned this detail when her father had originally explained the principles to her, but it followed logically and she was satisfied with it. On the evening of November 22nd, she climbed down through the trap door for the first time with the intention of spending the night. She pulled the door closed above her. She latched it from below with a wooden peg. She lit the small oil lamp and set it in the corner by the oven, which was still warm from the afternoon's test burn. She sat for a moment on the layered blankets and looked at the chamber. The walls were earth. The ceiling was raw timber. The air smelled of clay and wood smoke and the faint, sweet sourness of Bessie's proximity. Outside, the temperature was 15 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. In here, it was 54. Margaret placed her palm flat against the eastern wall. The earth was warm, not hot, not even close to what a fire could produce, but warm in the way of something that had been warm for a very long time and intended to stay that way. Her father had said the earth remembers warmth. Standing in a coal shaft at the age of 40, missing one finger, drawing diagrams with charred wood on flour sacks, he had said exactly that. She kept her hand against the wall for a while. She did not think about Edmund or the legal papers or the 30 days which had come and gone and meant nothing because she was still here. She did not think about the coming winter or the dwindling food supply or the fact that no one in Ember Ridge expected her to be alive by Christmas. She thought about her father's hand, the 3 fingers and the thumb, the way he drew with his middle finger instead of his index, as if the missing finger had taught him to find another way. Then she lay down on the layered blankets, pulled the deer hide over herself, and for the first time since Thomas had stopped breathing at 4 in the morning on the 14th of April, she slept through the night without waking. Above her, Bessie chewed slowly in the dark. Outside, the temperature dropped to 9 degrees. The clouds that had been building all day from the direction of the Dakotas settled over Ember Ridge like a decision that had already been made. The winter was just beginning to show what it intended to do. Margaret Owen slept through the whole thing 5 feet below the surface in the warmth the earth had been keeping for her. She had been underground for 15 days when she found the basket. It was sitting at the woodshed door on the morning of November 21st, set down carefully on the top step covered with a square of burlap against the snow. Half a loaf of bread, 4 eggs nested in a fold of cloth, a small jar of preserved plums, the lid sealed with wax. No name, a torn corner of brown paper tucked under the corn with 2 words written in pencil. From a friend. Margaret stood in the doorway of the shed, still holding the lamp from her, climb up through the trap door, and looked at the basket for a long moment. She looked at the snow around it. 1 set of boot prints, small, coming from the direction of the road. No prints going around the shed. Whoever it was had set the basket down and left without lingering, which meant they had not wanted to be seen. She brought the basket inside. She sat on an upturned crate near Bessie and ate half the bread without heating it, tearing pieces and chewing slowly. The plums she opened with her thumbnail and ate with a spoon standing because there was something in eating fruit in November that felt like an occasion worth standing for. The eggs she saved for the evening. That was the first morning in 7 weeks that she did not count what she ate. She never found out with certainty who left the basket. She had her suspicions. But suspicions were not something she spent much time on. What she took from it was simpler and more durable than any name could have made it. Somewhere in Ember Ridge, someone had decided she was worth a half loaf of bread and a jar of plums and had acted on that decision in the dark before sunrise without requiring acknowledgement. That was more than she had expected from this town. She filed it alongside the things that kept her from feeling entirely alone and went back underground to tend the oven. The days had a shape now, and shape was what kept her steady. 5 in the morning, up through the trapdoor to check on Bessie break ice from the water trough with the flat of an axe head, fill the copper pot with packed snow. Back down to heat the water on the clay oven. Breakfast was cornmeal porridge, 1 measured cup of dry grain to 3 cups of water, a pinch of salt, sometimes a spoonful of the honey she was rationing through January. She ate at the small crate she used as a table and read by lamplight from the two books she had brought down, a worn agricultural almanac and a Bible she did not read religiously, but found useful for the rhythmic passages which settled her mind in the evenings, the way a particular kind of music might. Mid-morning she came up to work. Small tasks mostly, mending harness straps, patching the gap in the shed's north wall where wind had found a channel between two boards, reorganizing the food stores to keep the items requiring the most stable temperature closest to the trapdoor. She tracked every pound. 40 pounds of navy beans at the start, now 31. 20 pounds of salted pork, now 16. She was eating less than she had calculated, and she allowed herself to feel briefly satisfied by that before moving on. Afternoon, she wrote in her journal. Not extensively. She was not a woman given to elaborate self-examination and writing, but she had found in the weeks since Thomas died that a few sentences at day's end served as a kind of accounting. It told her where she had been. It told her she had moved. November 18th read, 15th day of preparation. Outside temperature, I estimate -5 based on behavior of the water in the trough. Inside, 53. Bessie continues well. Right hand still showing the old calluses from the dig. No visitors, no word from the Crane brothers. Still here. She underlined those last two words, not for emphasis, for record. The trouble with Dorothea Fitch was not that she was malicious. Margaret understood that clearly. Dorothea was a woman of genuine concern and genuine nosiness, in proportions she could not herself distinguish between, and the combination made her in certain situations more dangerous than any deliberately hostile person. She lived 3/4 of a mile west with her husband, who sat on the same informal council of landowners that Edmund Crane consulted on property matters. She had sharp eyes and a sharper memory for details that did not add up. And what did not add up, from Dorothea's perspective, was the smoke. It was thin, she told Reverend Pratt on the first Sunday of December. It came from near the back of the woodshed, not from the cabin chimney. She had watched it on 3 separate mornings. 2, perhaps 3 pounds of wood per day, she estimated. That was not enough to heat a room. It was barely enough to heat a pot. Pratt listened with the careful attention he gave to all parish information. He thanked Dorothea for her concern, which was genuine. Then after the service, he walked to his wagon and stood beside it for a moment before getting in. He had said something to Edmund Crane at Thomas's funeral, an observation about Margaret's father and the man's habit of always knowing where the second exit was. He had meant it as a caution, a small warning that this woman might prove more stubborn than expected. He had not meant it as a prediction. But standing beside his wagon in the December cold, watching his breath cloud and disperse, he wondered whether he had underestimated what he was warning against. He did not go to see Margaret himself. He went instead to Edmund, and he said simply, "The woman is still there, still managing something I cannot account for, and you should probably know that." Edmund received this information in the way he received most information that contradicted his existing plans, with a brief silence, a controlled expression, and a decision made before the silence ended. He would go see for himself. He arrived on the afternoon before Thanksgiving, Wallace riding beside him, both men in heavy coats and the particular posture of people who have rehearsed their purpose on the ride over. They stopped their horses at the edge of the yard and surveyed the woodshed. Smoke was rising thin and steady from somewhere near the rear wall. The shed door was closed. The window was fogged from inside. Edmund dismounted and walked to the shed door. He tried the handle, latched from inside. He stepped back and looked at the window again, then walked slowly around the perimeter of the structure, examining it the way a man does when he is trying to understand something he cannot quite see. He found the stovepipe outlet at the back, disguised behind a stack of firewood. He stood looking at it for a moment. Then he walked to the shed wall and looked through the gap between two boards. He could see Bessie standing calmly in the pen Margaret had built, deep in fresh straw breath, steaming gently in the air. The cow looked well-fed and untroubled. This was the detail that changed the temperature of Edmund's thinking. A cow standing in fresh straw in late November meant that someone had been managing this shed with intention and regularity. Not surviving, managing. Those were different things, and Edmund Crane, who had run a working farm for 20 years, knew exactly the difference. He stepped back from the wall. Margaret was below the shed floor at that moment, sitting on her sleeping pallet with her back against the earth wall, the journal open on her knee, listening. She had heard the horses come. She had heard Edmund's boots on the frozen ground, the particular weight and cadence of them. She heard him walk around the shed. She heard him stop at the back wall where the pipe outlet was. The distance between them was 14 inches of old pine floorboard and 5 feet of earth. She could hear him breathing. She did not move. She did not shift her weight. She held the journal open on her knee and looked at the wall and listened. Wallace's voice came from the direction of the horses, slightly muffled. She's not answering because she's not in there. She probably left 2 weeks ago. Edmund did not respond immediately. Then she's been feeding this cow. Edmund, fresh straw, Wallace. Someone put fresh straw down in the last 2 days. Another silence. Then Wallace said with a different quality in his voice, "Let the winter have her. Save us the trouble." Edmund stood where he was for a few more seconds. Margaret counted them. Then his boots moved. He went back to his horse. He mounted. She heard the creak of saddle leather, and then the sound of both horses moving away across the frozen ground, unhurried in the direction of the main road. She waited until she could hear nothing. Then she opened her journal and wrote, "They came. Edmund found the pipe. He found the straw. He knows someone is here. He does not know what I have done." Good. She paused. Then she wrote one more line. Wallace said, "To let the winter have me." Edmund said nothing. These are different things. She closed the journal. She lay down on the pallet and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since November 3rd, she was not tired enough to sleep immediately. She lay awake for a while, not from fear, but from the peculiar alertness that comes when you realize you are actually winning something, and that winning changes the shape of what comes next. December arrived the way it always did in that part of Wisconsin, not gradually but all at once, like a door being kicked open. The temperature on December 1st was 22 degrees. By the 6th, it was 11. On the 8th, the first serious storm arrived from the northwest, 6 inches of heavy wet snow that fell in under 8 hours and turned the road into a white absence. Margaret came up through the trap door that morning to find the shed half buried against the north wall, the snow piled to the lower edge of the single window. She broke ice from the water trough, refilled Bessie's hay, checked the stovepipe outlet to ensure it was clear, and went back down. The temperature in the chamber was 53. She ate breakfast and marked the date in the almanac. It was on the return from that morning's water run that she saw Dr. Albert Morse for the first time. He was standing on the road that ran along the property's eastern edge, sitting straight in the saddle of a gray mare, looking at the woodshed with the focused stillness of a man doing mathematics. He had a dark coat and a hat pulled low and a leather satchel across his shoulder that she had seen before at the county fair, where Morse had set up a small examination table for the afternoon. He was the only doctor within 20 miles. He was also, she had observed over years of occasional contact, a man who believed deeply in the explanatory power of facts and distrusted anything that appeared to contradict them. She watched him from inside the shed door, which was open 2 inches. He did not know she was there. He sat on the horse for several minutes looking. She could see him reach into his coat and produce a small notebook. He wrote something. He looked at the shed again, then at the thin line of smoke from the rear pipe, then back at his notebook. He wrote something more. Then he closed the notebook, turned the horse, and rode toward town at a steady pace. He had not knocked. He had not called out. He had observed, recorded, and left. Margaret found this more unsettling than a confrontation would have been. A confrontation had known boundaries. An observer had none. She spent the rest of that morning wondering what he had written. She found out in part 3 days later, when the temperature dropped to -12 and stayed there. Morse had ridden to Edmund Crane's property on the evening of December 10th and said in the direct manner of a man reporting a clinical finding, "The woman on your land is alive, and I cannot explain her fuel consumption. I thought you should know." Edmund had received this information and said, "She is dying slowly. Leave it alone." Morse had looked at him for a moment. Then he had said carefully, "I am not certain of that, and I have been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I am generally certain of what dying looks like." Edmund had shown him to the door. Margaret did not know the content of this conversation when it happened. She learned it later in pieces from sources she trusted. But she felt its effect 2 days after it occurred, when she came up through the trap door on the morning of December 13th and found a fresh set of boot prints in the snow around the shed, going all the way to the back wall and then to the south side, as if someone had performed a slow, methodical circumnavigation. Not Edmund's boots. Too small. Not Wallace. She crouched down and studied the size and depth and the particular way the heel struck. A man who walked on his heels, which was a doctor's habit from years of standing at bedsides. He had come in the night when she would not have heard him from below. She stood in the snow in the early morning gray and looked at those prints for a while. Then she went back down and added wood to the oven and did not change anything about her daily routine because changing anything would mean she was afraid, and she was not afraid. She was alert. These were not the same. The second storm came on December 17th. It announced itself the day before as a particular quality of stillness, the wind dropping off completely, the sky going from pale gray to the flat white of a blank page. Margaret recognized the signs and spent the 16th bringing extra straw down through the trapdoor, checking the ventilation pipe, and moving the food stores away from the wall that faced north. She heated 6 stones to 300 degrees that evening and arranged them carefully around the sleeping pallet. 18 inches fell in 36 hours. The wind ran at 40 miles an hour for most of it, piling the snow against the south and west sides of the shed until the walls were insulated by 2 feet of packed white. Margaret discovered on the second morning of the storm that this additional insulation had raised the chamber temperature by nearly 3 degrees. She noted it in the journal without editorial comment. What she could not note, because she did not know it yet, was what was happening above her in the town. A man named Samuel Ward had tried to cross from his house to his barn on the morning of December 21st. The distance was 70 feet. He did not make it. His son Daniel found him face down in the snow 40 feet from the barn door unconscious, his coat frozen stiff as board. They dragged him inside and worked over him for 3 hours by the fire. He lived. He lost 4 fingers on his right hand and 2 toes on the left. Dr. Morse, who had been awake for 31 straight hours by that point, removed them on Christmas Eve with a bone saw, while Samuel Ward's wife held one of her husband's remaining hands and looked at the ceiling. Samuel Ward made no sound during the procedure. He lost consciousness before the 3rd finger and did not regain it for 6 hours. There was a family named Mills on the South Road. James Mills was a farmer of modest means and a careful man, the kind who always finished his work before dark and latched every gate. He had 2 children. Bobby was 7 years old and had a habit of asking questions about clouds. Lucy was 4 and had, according to everyone who knew her, the most direct brown eyes anyone had seen in a child that age. On the night of December 22nd, the Mills family stove went cold. James and his wife had been splitting wood for 4 consecutive days in temperatures that fell below -20 at night. They were not lazy. They were not careless. They were exhausted in the way that a person becomes when the body is asked to produce more heat than it can continuously generate. And exhaustion at that level does not ask permission before it takes what it needs. They fell asleep. The fire burned to coals, then to ash, then to nothing. The house went cold by midnight. By 4 in the morning, the inside temperature was 12 degrees. Bobby and Lucy Mills did not wake up. The coffins were stored in the basement of the Lutheran church because the ground was too frozen to dig graves. They would stay there until spring. James Mills did not cry at the church service. He did not cry in the weeks that followed, and people who knew him took this as a sign of either great strength or great damage, and were not wrong about either. Margaret Owens knew none of this while it was happening. Below the floor of her woodshed in the warmth the earth had been holding since before any of them were born, she slept soundly on the night of December 22nd. She was not indifferent to the suffering above her. She simply did not know about it. And not knowing was in this particular winter sometimes the same thing as surviving it. The Beckett family had been burning furniture since the 22nd. Owen Beckett was 44 years old, a carpenter by trade, a man who had built things with his hands his entire adult life and took a builder's particular pride in the quality of what he made and what he maintained. The chairs he had burned on the 22nd he had made himself 12 years ago from cherry wood with turned legs and a joinery he was still proud of. He had fed them into the fireplace one at a time because feeding them in whole would have been worse. Helen, his wife, had watched the first chair go in and then gone to the other room and did not come back until the fire was going strong. On the 23rd, he burned the table. On the 24th, he looked at the cabinet in the bedroom, the one Helen's father had carried from Ohio in 1879, dark walnut with a brass pull on each drawer that Helen polished twice a year. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, looking at it for a while. Helen came up beside him. "Don't," she said. He burned it anyway because their daughter May was 8 years old and had stopped shivering 2 hours ago, which was not a sign that she was warming up. It was the opposite sign. He had seen it in a calf once in a bad winter early in their marriage, and he knew what it meant, and he was not going to let it mean that about his daughter. Helen did not look at the cabinet when it went in. She did not touch the brass pulls. She stood at the far end of the room with her back turned and her arms crossed, and she was very still and very quiet, in a way that was harder for Owen to witness than crying would have been. Their other daughter, Ida, was 11. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her father feed the cabinet into the fire piece by piece and said nothing. She had dark eyes and the particular quality of attention that occasionally appears in children who have been listening to adult conversations for years without being noticed. Owen had always found this quality in Ida slightly unnerving. Right now, he found it the most comforting thing in the room because it told him she understood the situation clearly and was not panicking, and panic was the thing he could least afford to spread. It was Ida who said, at approximately 4 in the afternoon on Christmas Eve, "Papa, the woodshed." Owen turned from the fireplace. "What?" "Mrs. Owens's woodshed. I saw smoke from it 2 days ago when I went to the well. Thin smoke, but regular." Owen looked at her. "She's still there," Ida said. It was not a question and not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who had thought it through and determined it was relevant. Helen turned from the window she had been staring out of. "That woman has nothing, Owen. She's no better off than we are." Owen looked at the fire which was burning on the last of the walnut cabinet. Then he looked at May, who was sitting on the floor in 3 layers of clothing, with a blanket around her shoulders and her eyes at half-mast. "Ida," he said, "you're sure about the smoke?" "Regular smoke," Ida said. "Every morning I saw it, small but steady." Owen was quiet for a moment. He thought about what regular smoke from a near-empty shed meant. He was a man who worked with materials, who understood the difference between something burning out and something burning by design. Steady smoke was not accident. Steady smoke was management. "If she's managing something over there," he said slowly to no one in particular, "she knows something we don't." Helen Owen, she was going to be dead by October. That's what everyone said. "Everyone said it," Owen agreed. "And it's Christmas Eve, and Morris told Edmund she's still alive, and I saw the cow through the shed window last week." He stood up. "The cow Helen. If Margaret Owens was dead, that cow would be dead too. That cow is not dead." Helen stared at him. Then she looked at Ida, who was already watching her father with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this decision. They left at first light on Christmas morning. They wore every piece of warm clothing they owned and carried the girls. May was wrapped in both remaining blankets. Ida walked on her own, which she had insisted on without drama, simply standing in the doorway in her boots and coat and looking at her father until he stopped arguing. The snow was knee-deep on Owen and waist-deep on the girls in the worst stretches. 3 miles. The temperature was -18 and the sky was the hard flat white that comes after a storm has spent itself, no wind, no cloud, just cold that had arrived at its final decision and intended to stay. Margaret heard them coming from below ground. Not their voices, not yet. Their footsteps. 4 people in the snow, the weight distribution of adults and children, the particular hesitation of people who are not certain they are doing the right thing but are doing it anyway. She had been awake for an hour already, lying on the pallet, listening to the winter's specific silence, which was different from summer silence in a way she had learned to read like weather. She climbed up through the trap door with the oil lamp in her hand. Owen Beckett was standing in the doorway of the shed. His wife stood just behind him, and behind her the 2 girls, May bundled beyond recognition. Ida standing straight with her hands at her sides. Owen's face was the face of a man who had been very cold for a very long time and did not want to admit how close to the edge of it he was. Helen's hands, visible at the cuff of her coat, were shaking in a way that was not voluntary. Margaret took in all of this in approximately 3 seconds. "Come down," she said. The chamber held all 5 of them barely. Owen had to sit with his knees drawn up. Helen sat with her back against the east wall, and May immediately crawled into her lap and pulled the blanket around both of them. Ida stood for a moment looking at the oven, the walls, the arrangement of the space, with an expression that was not wonder exactly, but was something more purposeful than wonder. Margaret set water to heat. The warmth settled into the Beckett family, the way warmth does when the body has been genuinely cold, not gradually and pleasantly, but in stages that each felt like an arrival. Owen's hands, which had been bloodless and stiff, began to ache as the feeling came back, and he pressed them together and said nothing. Helen stopped shaking sometime around the 2nd cup of hot water, and when she stopped shaking, she began to cry quietly, and without explanation, her face turned slightly toward the earth wall. May fell asleep. Not the dangerous half-sleep she had been in the night before, but real sleep, a child's sleep, sudden and complete, her head on her mother's shoulder, her breathing regular. Margaret watched all of this from the far side of the chamber, tending the oven, not making conversation. There was nothing to say that the warmth was not saying better. It was Ida who spoke first after perhaps 20 minutes. She had been standing near the oven, examining the construction of it, running her fingers along the mortared joints between the stones. "How did you know how to build this?" she asked. She asked it the way a person asks about a technique, not about a miracle. Margaret looked at her across the small space. 11 years old, dark eyes standing straight despite the low ceiling. "My father taught me the idea," she said. "I worked out the rest." Ida considered this. She looked at the east wall, placed her palm flat against it the way Margaret had done on the first night, held it there. She felt the warmth. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone confirming a hypothesis. "I'm going to remember this," Ida said, not as a promise to Margaret, as a statement of fact about herself. Margaret nodded once and went back to tending the oven. Before the family left, Owen stood at the bottom of the trapdoor ladder and looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who has used up all his pride on something that needed to be done and does not regret it. "Thank you," he said. "I'll remember this." "Tell no one," she said. Owen nodded. He meant it. He was simply not a man who could keep that kind of thing. On the walk home, Ida carried May for the last half mile, her sister's weight across her back, her boots punching through the snow's frozen crust with each step. Her father had offered twice to take May. Ida had refused both times. She was thinking about the east wall, about what she had felt when she pressed her palm flat against the earth and found warmth there, specific and stable in the middle of the coldest week anyone in Ember Ridge could remember. She was thinking about the oven, about the angle of the ventilation pipe, about the way the chamber's dimensions created a space that held warmth without wasting it. When she got home after May had been put to bed and her parents were sitting in exhausted silence by the rebuilt fire, Ida found her school composition book. She opened it to a blank page near the back. She drew from memory in pencil a cross-section diagram of the underground chamber. The walls, the depth, the oven in the northwest corner. The pipe angle, she drew it carefully, correcting herself once on the depth, erasing and redrawing the line. The proportions were nearly exact. She had been down there for 2 hours in dim lamplight, watching rather than measuring. She had been 11 years old, and the diagram was nearly exact. She closed the book and put it in her coat pocket and went to sleep. 3 miles away, in the warmth below the woodshed floor, Margaret Owens added 2 small sticks to the oven, checked the temperature of the remaining heated stones, and lay down on the pallet. She thought for a moment about Ida Beckett's hand on the wall. The child had not asked how it worked. She had pressed her hand against the earth and felt what was there and filed it. That was the right way to learn a thing. Margaret's father had taught her that. She closed her eyes. Above her, the temperature outside was settling toward its lowest reading yet. The sky over Ember Ridge was clear and brutal and full of stars that looked in that cold, like something hard and indifferent being hammered into the dark. 3 days later, Edmund Crane would stand outside her door in the same cold without enough coat with frozen hands, and he would not be able to knock. And Margaret Owens would be the one to open it. Edmund Crane stood outside the woodshed door in the late afternoon of December 28th and could not knock. He had ridden over with Wallace. They had not discussed what they were going to say on the ride because neither of them had words for it yet, and speaking before you had the right words was a thing Edmund had learned to avoid. So they had ridden in silence for 3 miles through snow that was waist-deep in the drifts and iron-hard, where it had been packed by wind, and they had arrived at the yard of the Crane property, which had been the Crane property for 30 years before Thomas ever brought a wife to it, and Edmund had dismounted and stood in front of the woodshed door and put his hand up to knock and then not knocked. His right hand was the problem. The frostbite had set in 2 days earlier when he had gone out to check on the horses in the middle of the night without his good gloves because his good gloves were not where he had left them. 3 fingers on the right hand had gone white and then gray and were now a deep red that hurt when pressure was applied. He could still use the hand. He could not close it into a fist. Wallace stood behind him, mounted, still watching. The door opened. Margaret looked at them both. She had heard the horses in the yard from below ground, and she had climbed up and stood in the shed for a full minute before opening the door, which gave her time to decide what her face was going to do. What she decided was nothing particular. Not satisfaction, not coldness, just the ordinary expression of a person opening a door to see who is there. Edmund was not wearing enough coat. She could see that immediately. The coat he had on was a working coat, good for November, inadequate for what this December had become. His right hand hanging at his side was the wrong color. Wallace behind him was looking somewhere to the left of Margaret's face in the way people do when they cannot look directly at the thing they have come for. Edmund did not speak. He was standing there with the residue of 30 years of certainty about how the world worked and the specific 4 weeks in which that certainty had been dismantled piece by piece, and he had arrived at a moment he had no language for, and so he said nothing. Margaret stepped to one side. That was all. She simply moved to one side of the doorway and left it open. Edmund came in. Wallace followed. The chamber held the two of them along with Margaret, which required arrangement. Edmund sat against the south wall with his legs extended because the ceiling was too low to sit any other way. Wallace took the corner near the trap door, knees drawn up, his hat in his hands. Margaret sat near the oven in her usual position, which was slightly to one side, giving the warm space to move. She gave them water heated to just below boiling, poured into tin cups. Edmund took his with the left hand. He wrapped both hands around the cup eventually when the heat had worked far enough into his fingers that he trusted them to grip. Nobody spoke for a very long time. The oven put out its steady, modest warmth. Bessie moved above them, a slow weight crossing the floorboards. The sounds of the outside world, the wind finding gaps in the shed boards, the settling of snow from the roof came through as something distant and irrelevant, the sounds of a country that did not apply down here. Wallace was the one who looked around, first really looked, taking in the walls, the ceiling, the construction. He looked at the stovepipe angled upward in the corner. He looked at the oven. He was a man who had worked with wood and stone his whole life and understood what it took to build a thing that functioned, and he was looking at this chamber with the eyes of someone recalculating. Edmund stared at the clay oven. He had been in this room for 20 minutes, and he was warm for the first time in 4 days. And he understood in the particular way that physical relief produces clarity what that meant, what it cost, what it required of the person who had built it. He looked at his hands on the tin cup. He looked at the right hand, the damaged fingers, the color that was slowly moving back towards something normal. He did not look at Margaret. Margaret sat near the oven and was quiet as she had learned to be quiet, which was not the same as being absent. She was paying attention to all of it. Edmund's hands, the angle of Wallace's shoulders, the gradual slowing of their breathing as their bodies recognized that they were safe for now and could afford to slow down. 3 hours passed that way. The oven needed feeding twice. Margaret fed it both times with pieces of oak no longer than her forearm, moving with the economy of someone who had been managing this space for 7 weeks and knew exactly what it required. When it was time for them to leave, Edmund stood and had to bend his neck because of the ceiling and move toward the trap door. He climbed the ladder. At the top, with one hand on the shed floor and one foot still on the rung, he stopped. His back was to Margaret. He was looking at the interior of the shed above at Bessie and her pen, at the last gray light coming through the frosted window. He stayed like that for a moment. "Thank you," he said. It came out at a volume that was almost not there. A man saying something he had not said in a very long time, possibly ever, in this particular direction. He did not wait for a response. He climbed up and out. Wallace followed. At the top of the ladder, he paused with his hand on the wooden floor of the shed the same way he might pause with his hand on a workbench, feeling the grain, not looking at Margaret, just feeling the wood. Then he climbed out. Margaret heard them cross the shed floor. She heard the outer door open and close. She heard the horses move away into the evening. She sat beside the oven for a while longer, not moving. The fire did not need tending. She simply sat. After a while, she reached into her coat pocket and took out the small, flat stone she had carried since early November, the one with the worn carving of a bird on one face. She turned it over in her fingers, once, twice the way she had done 100 times during those weeks when she needed something small and solid to hold on to. Then she set it on the flat top of the clay oven, where the warmth could reach it, and left it there. She did not write in the journal that night. Some days did not need an accounting. Some days were their own record. The cold broke on January 2nd. It did not break dramatically. There was no particular event, no wind shift, no visible change in the sky. The temperature simply moved from -20 at dawn to -8 by mid-morning to 0 by noon, and by late afternoon it was sitting at 15 degrees, which felt after the previous 2 weeks like an entirely reasonable suggestion about how cold it was possible to be. Margaret came up through the trap door on the morning of January 2nd and stepped outside for the first time in 4 days. She stood in the yard beside the shed with her coat open, which she would not have done a week ago. The air was still cold, but it had changed its nature. The killing edge was gone. What remained was ordinary winter, the kind she had known her entire life, the kind that could be managed with firewood and wool and a reasonable amount of sense. Bessie stood at the shed door behind her watching. Margaret looked out over the property. The fields were buried under 2 feet of snow, featureless and white, with no indication yet of what was underneath. The tree line to the north was dark and still. The road to the east was a white absence between 2 rows of buried fence posts. Somewhere in the direction of town, thin columns of smoke were rising from chimneys, more of them than there had been a week ago, which meant people were managing again, which meant most of them had made it through. She put her hand on Bessie's neck and stood there for a while. She was thinking about rye, about the northeast corner of the field which Thomas had watched for 3 years before he tried the barley, about what she was going to plant in spring and what the soil would require. She was making plans, which meant she had survived long enough for plans to be the appropriate thing to make. She was 32 years old. She had spent 7 weeks living in a hole she dug herself, and she had come out of it in better condition than most of the town that had predicted her death. She did not feel particularly triumphant about this. She felt the way her father had described feeling after they broke through to the sealed pocket and found the warm air, confirmed, not surprised, as if the world had simply done what you understood it would do if you understood it correctly. She went back inside and ate breakfast and added to the journal January 2nd. Cold broke, still here. Rye in spring. The story left the woodshed the way water finds a channel, inevitably following the path of least resistance through the people who could not hold it. Owen Beckett told his neighbor Bergstrom on December 26th because Bergstrom's wife had not gotten out of bed in 3 days, and he thought they needed to know. Bergstrom told his brother-in-law Holt, who had 4 children and a fire that was nearly out. Holt came to Margaret's shed on the 27th with his oldest son, 12 years old, and they sat in the chamber for 90 minutes and warmed themselves and took 3 heated stones wrapped in flannel to carry home for the night. By the 28th, 11 people had come. Margaret turned none of them away. She showed each one how to hold the wrapped stones, how long they would stay warm, how to position them near sleeping children. She gave away portions of her food stores that she had not planned to give away. She recalculated her remaining supply that evening and determined she had enough for 3 more weeks if she ate less than she had been eating, which she could do. Harold Briggs arrived on the 27th with 2 other men from town, standing in the doorway of the shed with his hat in his hand and a quality in his posture that Margaret had not seen in him before, which was the quality of a man who has been wrong about something in a way that cost other people, and who knows it. He said, "I heard you had heated stones." She brought out 3 already wrapped. She handed them to each man in turn. Briggs took his and held it and looked at it and then looked up at her. He started to say something. He started twice, and both times it did not become words. "Margaret, Harold, it's cold. Go home." He went. But at the door he stopped for just a moment, and she saw him take note of the shed, the ventilation pipe, the arrangement of the wood pile that concealed its outlet. He was making the same recalculation Wallace had made in the chamber. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. She let him. Dorothea Fitch came on the 28th. She did not come with a basket this time, and she did not come in a group. She came alone in the morning, and when Margaret opened the shed door, Dorothea stood in the snow and said directly, "I told Reverend Pratt you would not survive until Christmas. I was wrong. I brought flour." She held out a half-full sack of white flour, good milling flour, the kind Margaret had not had since October. Margaret took the flour. "You can come in," she said, "if you want to understand it." Dorothea came in. She went down through the trap door without hesitation, which Margaret had not expected, and she stood in the chamber and turned slowly and looked at everything. She asked 3 questions, all of them practical. Margaret answered all 3. When Dorothea climbed back out, she was quiet in the way of someone reorganizing a large amount of information, and she did not say anything useful until she was at the shed door again. "I'm going to tell people," she said, not asking permission, stating a fact. "I know," Margaret said. Dr. Albert Morse came on December 29th. He came in the afternoon alone on foot, which was unusual for a man who had a horse and was known to use it in all conditions. Margaret saw him coming from the shed window, a figure in a dark coat crossing the field from the road, moving carefully through the deep snow, carrying his leather satchel. She watched him come the whole distance. She did not go out to meet him. He knocked. She opened the door. He looked at her for a moment. He looked the way a man looks when he has been conducting an argument with himself for several weeks and has finally arrived at a conclusion he is not entirely comfortable with. Mrs. Owens, and he said, I owe you an explanation, possibly more than one. Come in, she said. She took him down through the trap door. He stood in the chamber with his satchel over his shoulder and looked around with the eyes she had seen him use at the county fair. The careful, systematic inventory of a man who gathers evidence before forming opinions. He reached into his coat and produced his thermometer. He held it in the air at the center of the chamber. Waited, read it. He looked at her. 56, he said. Today, yes, it varies a degree or two. He looked at the oven. He looked at the walls. He looked at the pipe angle in the corner. He opened his notebook and began to write, and then he stopped writing and looked at what he had written and closed the notebook. I went to Edmund Crane in early December, he said. I told him you were still alive. I told him I could not explain your fuel consumption. He paused. He told me you were dying slowly and to leave it alone. I left it alone. Margaret looked at him without particular expression. Samuel Ward lost fingers on the 21st, Morse continued. The Mills children died on the 22nd. 2 children, Mrs. Owens. I was the one who went to the Mills house in the morning, and I was the one who had to tell James Mills what had happened to his children. His voice did not change its register, but something in it shifted. I have been a doctor for 20 years. I understand that I cannot prevent every death, but those children died because their fire went out, and you have been 50 yards from the edge of town with a system that does not require a large fire, and I said nothing after December 10th because Edmund Crane asked me to leave it alone. He sat down on the floor of the chamber, which Margaret had not expected. A man in a good coat and a doctor's professional bearing sitting down on an earthen floor. He set the satchel beside him. I would like to understand this completely, he said. Every part of it, not for Edmund, not for the county record. Because next winter and the winter after that, there are people in this town who could use this knowledge, and I am the person with the best opportunity to put it in front of them. He opened the notebook to a clean page. He held the pencil and looked at her. Will you show me? Margaret looked at him for a moment. He had gray eyes and a precise way of holding still that she had always associated with people who were genuinely listening. She thought about the Mills children. She had not known them well, but she had seen them at church, Bobby with his questions about clouds, and Lucy with those direct brown eyes. She thought about what Morse had said, I was the one who had to tell James Mills. She picked up a piece of charred wood from beside the oven. She looked around for something to draw on, and the only thing available was the back of the flour sack Dorothea had brought that morning. She smoothed it flat on the floor. She began to draw. She drew for 40 minutes, the chamber dimensions, the soil composition, considerations, the oven placement, the ventilation geometry, the heat stone system. Morse asked questions and she answered them. His questions were good, the kind that indicated he was not just recording, but integrating. He pushed back twice on technical points, and both times she worked through the pushback with him until they arrived at the same conclusion by slightly different routes. When she finished, Morse looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he said, Your father taught you this. The principle, Margaret said. I worked out the application. How old were you when he taught you the principle? 15. Morse nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. The woman who taught herself to build this alone at 32 in 9 days under circumstances that would have broken most people. He said it in the tone of a physician reading a finding aloud, not as flattery, but as an attempt to accurately characterize what he was looking at. Margaret, I had enough time and no better options. Most people have neither, Morse said. He took the flour sack drawing carefully and folded it into his satchel. He stood, which required him to bend at the neck. He climbed the ladder. At the top, he turned back. I'll present this at the town meeting in March, he said. Under your name, I will make clear where it came from. Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then, make sure they understand the ventilation. That's the part people will skip, and it's the part that kills you if you skip it. Morse, I understand. And Morse, he paused. The Mills children. That is not your fault, and it is not mine. It is the fault of a winter that should have been prepared for differently, and now people know how. She paused. That is the only thing that can be done about it now. Morse looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, climbed out, and was gone. Spring came in the second week of March, arriving the way springs arrive after brutal winters, cautiously testing its own intentions. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. The road became mud. The smell of the earth changed that particular release of something held under pressure for months, and Margaret walked the property for the first time since November, with her boots sinking into the softening ground. The county clerk's decision came by letter in the middle of March, following the publication of Frederick Nance's article in the Wisconsin State Journal on the 9th of February, under the headline that Nance had chosen the woman who taught a town to survive. The letter stated that in light of 8 years of continuous residence, cultivation, and maintenance of the property, and in light of sworn testimony from Owen Beckett, Dr. Albert Morse, and Dorothea Fitch Margaret Owens's claim to the property was recognized under common law. The Crane family had not contested. Margaret read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the tin box where she kept her important papers. Then she went outside and started preparing the northeast field for rye. The letters from the article arrived over the following weeks, forwarded by the newspaper. There were many of them. Some offered money, which she declined. Several were from men offering to remedy the fact of her widowhood, which she declined with less ceremony. A few were from women asking practical questions about the chamber construction, which she answered in detail. One letter was from a mining engineer in Michigan who wanted to know her father's name and where he had worked because the principles she had applied were consistent with techniques used in the Lake Superior copper mines in the 1840s, and he was interested in the lineage of the knowledge. She wrote back to the engineer. She told him about Joseph Weir, about the Pennsylvania coal fields, about the pocket of sealed warm air they had found when she was 15. She told him about the diagram drawn with charred wood on the back of a flour sack. She thought writing the letter that her father would have been interested to know his daughter had made his flour sack diagrams legible to a mining engineer in Michigan. She did not think about this with sentimentality. She thought about it with the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been done correctly, the original piece fitting into a larger pattern than the one it was made for. The town meeting in March was attended by most of the men in Ember Ridge and a number of women, which was unusual enough to be noted. Morse presented Margaret's method on a clean sheet of drafting paper he had copied from the flour sack original, attributing it clearly at the top, Method of E. Owens, Ember Ridge, Wisconsin, 1891 to 1892. There was some quiet laughter early in the presentation, the slightly embarrassed laughter of people who had been wrong about something in public. There was Harold Briggs in the back row, sitting with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who intends to pay careful attention. Briggs did not laugh. He asked 2 questions, both specific and technical, and Morse answered them. Briggs nodded, wrote something in the margin of his copy of the posted notice, and said nothing more. After the meeting, Briggs found Morse in the hallway and said, "The 5-inch pipe I mentioned to her in October. I still have it in inventory. Cost price anyone who needs it." Morse looked at him. "Briggs, she needed the 5-inch and I sold her the 4-inch at a markup. I knew what she needed." He held Morse's gaze evenly without apology in his voice, because Briggs was not a man who apologized in words. "Cost price, anyone who asks." Morse said, "I'll mention it." Ida Beckett was sitting in the 3rd row with her father. 11 years old, in her school coat, her composition book open on her knee. She had drawn a cleaner version of her pencil diagram from Christmas morning, based on Morse's presentation and her own memory of the chamber, and she was comparing the 2 drawings line by line to see where they differed. They differed in 3 places, all of them minor. She corrected her drawing. Then she looked up at Morse's rendering on the wall and back at her own and closed the book. Owen Beckett, watching his daughter from the corner of his eye, thought about what it meant that she had been able to draw that from memory from one afternoon in a dim chamber in December. He thought about the way she had stood at the door that Christmas morning and said, "The woman is still there," as if stating the coordinates of something she intended to navigate toward. He had always known Ida was watching more than she appeared to be watching. He had not understood until that winter what she was saving it for. After the meeting, Ida walked the 1.5 miles to Margaret's property alone. Her father had offered to come. She had declined in the way she declined most things she intended to do herself, which was simply by continuing to do them. Margaret was in the yard when Ida came up the road, turning over a section of the near field with a spade, preparing the ground for the first planting. She was wearing Thomas's old coat with the sleeves turned back, and her boots were already dark with mud. Ida stood at the gate. "I went to Dr. Morse's meeting," she said. Margaret straightened up. "How was it?" "He got the pipe angle right. He got the oven dimensions a little wrong. The interior volume should be slightly larger if you want to heat more than 6 stones at a time." Margaret looked at her. "You measured the oven." "I drew it from memory and compared it to his drawing. The difference is about 1/3 of a cubic foot. It matters if you're trying to heat stones for a larger family." Margaret was quiet for a moment. The field smelled of cold earth, beginning to warm that specific mineral smell that preceded everything growing. Bessie was visible through the open barn door, watching them both with the mild attention of a cow bus who has been through a difficult winter and finds the spring personally gratifying. "Do you want to know how to build one correctly?" Margaret asked. "Ida, I want to know how to build everything correctly." Margaret looked at her. 11 years old, mud to the ankle, the composition book visible in her coat pocket, the corner of it sticking out. The particular quality of attention in her face that had been there since the first morning in the chamber, since the moment she pressed her palm against the wall and felt what was there without being told what to feel. It was the same quality her father had described seeing in Margaret herself at 15, when she had sat at the kitchen table and asked two more questions after the explanation was finished because she had not been satisfied with understanding the principle without understanding the mechanism. "Can you start on Saturdays?" Margaret said. "Ida, I already am." She was standing at the gate with both hands at her sides and her eyes steady and her feet already pointing toward the field as if the conversation had concluded and the work was beginning. Margaret picked up the spade, then come through the gate. What happened in Ember Ridge in the years that followed was not remarkable in any way that made the newspapers again. It was the quiet kind of remarkable, the kind that accumulates in the habits and knowledge and choices of ordinary people until it becomes simply the way things are done. By 1895, there were 3 families on the North Road who kept a chamber dug and maintained beneath their root cellars as a matter of routine winter preparation. Ida Beckett, at 15, assisted in the construction of 2 of them, arriving on Saturday mornings with her composition book in a methodical manner that the men she worked alongside found to their own surprise they had no useful objection to. In the winter of 1900, another cold snap came through, worse than average, lasting 3 weeks below zero. Nobody in Ember Ridge died from the cold that winter. Dr. Morse noted this in his practice records and wrote in parentheses beside the entry CF. Owen's method implemented broadly. Owen Beckett told the story to his grandchildren in the 1910s and got most of it right, which is better than most stories managed across 2 generations. Ida Fletcher, as she was known by then, told it more accurately and with less sentiment, which was the way Margaret would have preferred it told. Margaret herself said very little about any of it, which was consistent with her character and with her understanding that the story had never been about her precisely. It had been about a thing her father knew and what she had been able to do with it, and what the people who came to her woodshed that December had been able to do with what they took from it. Knowledge moving outward from a coal miner's diagram on a flour sack through a woman's hands and into the earth and then back up through the hands of other people who needed it. She planted rye in the northeast corner that first spring as she had told Edmund she would. The soil responded the way Thomas had predicted it would when he was still alive and watching it. The yield was good. In the autumn of 1912, Margaret spent a Sunday afternoon sitting at the table where Edmund had once spread his legal papers, writing a letter to the Michigan engineer who had been corresponding with her for 20 years about the history of underground thermal techniques. She told him that she was in reasonable health and that she intended to be in reasonable health for some time yet. She told him she had a student who had been learning from her for over a decade and who would carry the knowledge forward in ways Margaret herself did not expect to see. She sealed the letter, left it on the table to go out with the next post, and went to bed. She died on the 3rd of March, 1913 in her sleep. She was 54 years old. She had lived on the property for 22 years after Thomas died, and no one had ever successfully argued her off it. Ida Fletcher was the one who found her in the morning. She sat beside the bed for a while before she did anything else, in the way that you sit with someone you have known for a long time and are now not ready to leave. Then she stood and went through the house in the systematic way Margaret had taught her to approach any assessment, first the important things, then the rest. In the tin box with the legal papers and the correspondence, there was a folded piece of brown paper tucked below everything else. Ida unfolded it. It was not a letter Margaret had written on the night before she began digging, the night of November 2nd, 1891. It was a list, written in pencil, Margaret's handwriting, the letter small and even. What I have: 87 acres. 1 cow, 14 chickens, 40 pounds beans, 1 spade. What my father taught me. What I need: nothing I don't already have. Ida read it twice. She folded it and held it in both hands for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she put it in her coat pocket next to the composition book she still carried out of habit after 22 years. The small, flat stone with the worn bird carving was sitting on the windowsill. Ida recognized it. She had seen Margaret handle it 100 times, turning it in her fingers when she was thinking through something difficult. She picked it up and put it in her other pocket. She went outside. The March air was cold but not dangerous. The ordinary cold of a season in transition, a cold that made promises it intended to keep. The field to the north was still white, the rye stubble from last autumn's harvest showing through in pale ridges, where the wind had scoured the snow, thin. The woodshed stood at the east side of the yard, weathered gray, still standing after 22 years of Wisconsin winters. The trap door below its floor was still latched, still functional. Ida had checked it herself 2 months ago on one of her Saturday visits, and the chamber below had been exactly as it always was. Walls smooth, oven cold, but intact, the air inside steady at 54 degrees. She stood in the yard and looked at the property, everything Thomas and Margaret had worked, everything Margaret had refused to leave, everything that was now by legal record and by every other meaningful measure the result of one woman knowing something that a frozen world had tried to make irrelevant. The sun was at the angle it gets in early March, low and without heat, but present the light falling flat across the snow and making the shadows of the fence posts long and thin. A crow was calling somewhere in the tree line to the north. Bessie had died in 1907 at a very old age for a cow, and there was a younger cow now in the barn, indifferent to history, doing what cows do in the morning. Ida walked to the woodshed. She opened the outer door. She lifted the trap door. She climbed down the ladder into the chamber one more time and stood in the low space with the morning light coming down through the open door above her. The walls were still smooth. The clay oven was cold and dark. The air in the chamber was 54 degrees, exactly as it had always been, exactly as it would be next winter, and the winter after, and every winter the earth had anything to say about it. She stood there for a while in the warmth that had nothing to do with fire, the warmth that the earth simply kept because that was what the earth did. Then she climbed out, latched the trapdoor behind her, and went to tell Owen Beckett that Margaret Owens was gone. The ground below the woodshed stayed warm. The seasons moved above it, and it paid them no particular attention. Cold came and went and came again. The years accumulated on the surface of things, while below, in the dark and quiet, the earth remembered what it had always known and kept its temperature the way it kept everything, without effort, without acknowledgement, without any need to be told that it was doing something worth doing. It simply held what it had been given. That was always enough.